every person who's like sincerely committed to some principle that they're starting a company not just to make money, but to accomplish any other purpose, is basically what they're saying is, I am slicing off some piece of human flourishing that's my piece to care about. So some people are, of course, focused on the environment. Some people are focused on efficiency. Some people are focused on beauty and art. There's like human flourishing is a vast tapestry that can support quite a lot of different missions and visions. But everyone's got to slice off some piece. And the counterintuitive finding in my research and in my experience is that if you do what you just described, you make that declaration consciously, and you take the steps to protect it, this crazy, almost unimaginable power is unleashed.
Eric, welcome to Innovators Inside. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are pleased to have you. I'm not going to lie. It's not every day that I get to host, one of the luminaries. I don't know if that's the right word, but one of the folks who I refer to so often in my day-to-day life on the pod. And I'm just going to do, this isn't hero worship. I'm just going to turn around. I'm going to pull your last book, a book, off my shelf and use this to set the stage, because the Lean Startup, which you wrote what must feel like forever ago now, has become pretty foundational in how a lot of people think, not just about building companies, but think about building innovation. And I'm just excited to talk to you about what's changed since you wrote this book.
Well, welcome to the pod. That's very kind of you to say. Yeah, thank you thanks for having me. And yeah, it's always a thrill when someone has the actual book on their actual shelf. There's something, in our highly digital age, there's still something very magical about these physical artifacts that get transmitted from person to person.
There is something very tangible, I think, about this topic, and it's very meaningful for a lot of business leaders, a lot of product leaders, and frankly, just a lot of nerds out there. And so Lane and I are just so excited to have you. And if it's okay, we want to jump right in, because you have written a new book. And this book takes a fairly different, it's a different approach. It's a different topic of study from sort of the pure focus on startups. And we want to hear all about it. So you ready to go? Should we jump in?
Let's jump in. I'm delighted.
All right, Lane, take it away.
Awesome. So I actually just wanted to start, and if you don't mind, I'd like to read an excerpt out of that book. Is that okay?
Yeah, please do.
All right, perfect. So the passage is as follows. The truth is, we're all one acquisition, one IPO, one board meeting away from watching something we love turn into something we hate. But we lack the vocabulary to call it what it really is. Mission drift sounds like a navigation error. Bureaucracy sounds like paperwork. Neither captures the gut punch of betrayal when something precious is corroded beyond recognition. So I call it by a simple, old-fashioned name, corruption. So I believe the title of your upcoming book is Incorruptible, and I'm wondering if you can dive in a little bit on that passage and that idea behind corruption and why you chose this name for the book.
Oh, thanks for that. Thanks for reading that passage. It means a lot to me. It's weird with a new book, you're not used to people quoting it to you yet. So it's like, oh, okay, right. Yeah, that's what it sounds like when someone reads it out loud. Thank you.
It was powerful stuff. I mean, the whole forward was just, oof. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad you felt that way. It was very emotional for me to write some of these parts, because it is strange to use that word. Like I acknowledge that it's not common to say that these are corrupt acts. And I'll tell you a funny story. There was someone who was telling me this story it's a story that they were telling me about going to dinner with a friend at the friend's favorite restaurant they hadn't been to in a while, and they decide to meet up and they go to the restaurant and they're sitting down. The friend's not looking kind of uncomfortable, and he takes one bite of the food and he pulls out his phone, and the person he's with is like, that's very rude. Why are you taking? He's like, hold on a second. I just need to know if this restaurant was taken over by private equity. And the guy's like, what? And he's like, literally like, yep, I freaking knew it. And like shows him the phone. And he's like, I could taste it. I knew from eating the food, something was wrong. Like, it's just a little bit, it was like the service was a little bit worse. Everything's just a little bit worse than it was before. I knew someone had taken it over. And I feel like this has become such a common experience for all of
Mm.
us. Everybody I talk to has a brand that they got ruined or something that got acquired, and you're like, now it's gone, or it's terrible, or it's just, whatever. Cory Doctorow, of course, calls the very profane and memorable word and shitification. And I just feel like the profanity is necessary because this is getting out of control. Like, I mean, I don't want to name specific products, but everyone knows, everyone's had this experience. I've actually had that experience. I've been in a restaurant and be like, what happened to this restaurant, and look it up. And the reason I use the word corruption for this is I think we have to really understand that we in our modern economy now have so many different ways of making money without creating any value at all. That's how
Yeah.
it's become. We've become totally used to it, and we're just like, it's been normalized. I hear all the time from people who are like, this corrupt person, this bad person. Well, you got to hand it to him. At least he got made a lot of money. And I'm like, no, you know what? We don't got to hand it to him. I don't have to hand any. I'm like, no, we don't. Our grandparents would have found most of these ways of making money to be closer to stealing than to creating value, and most of them would have been illegal, not in ancient Rome, but like even 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. So it's actually like many of these phenomena are very recent developments that we've gotten used to. And what I discovered, and I've worked with a lot of companies, okay, at this point. Lean Startup came out in 2011. Okay, so I've been doing this for like 20 years now. Um, so I've worked with a lot of builders, people who build things for a living. And I'm talking about founders, of course, CEOs, obviously board members, but I've also worked all up and down the stack. So I've been on the factory floor. I've talked to the person who actually assembles the dishwasher, their foreman, their manager. I've worked my way all up and down. So people who build things for a living all share what I call the builder's intuition, that the right way to make money is to create new value and capture it for yourself, some of it for yourself, but the world is otherwise better off. And we've all been told that we're supposed to pretend that we think the other ways of making money are also equally good, but nobody does. When we're alone, like people go to the bar after the workshop at night to be like, how to, like, there's no one who's like, what's even more awesome than making things, like trading a bunch of stocks and like skimming a little bit off the, like doing this little arbitrage. Like there's all these other ways of making money, and it's okay to say that they're not as good. And in fact, we've got it so backwards. We now have a society that glorifies these other ways of making money even more than building and making things. And so part of this is, I think, is just a very necessary corrective to get back to an older idea of what it means to create value, and why we've constructed a financial system whose moral logic is that voluntary, fully informed transactions create value. Like if you challenge any defender of capitalism for 200 years, I quote a whole bunch of them in the book, is that everyone retreats back to the same fundamental argument. And the issue is that argument is completely true. I really believe it. It's the ultimate magic trick, that when two people voluntarily trade, they're both better off. They're both
Yeah.
wealthier than they were before, even though all they did was swap two tangible. What an incredible miracle of social engineering and financial engineering. What a genius magic trick! But it only works if you meet the preconditions. And my lightning bolt realization that ultimately led me to write the book was that so many things we allow today violate one of those preconditions, but we celebrate it anyway.
Well, and let's talk about that, right?
Yeah.
You talk about things like false proxies, and you talk about financial metrics, and you talk about all of the scaffolding, I think you refer to the skeleton that we've kind of built up around how we celebrate success and measure success, right? That seems almost the polar opposite of the founders, the builders' intuition, right? The intuition that says, oh, like if I arrange this swap, we're both going to be better off. Is this emblematic of some of the challenges that you're talking about? Is there something more structural? Like, talk to me a little bit about the system that we've built that allows, decisions in the modern world to be the way they are.
Yeah, I really do try to trace the history in the book, and it took me a long time to understand it, and it's hard for people even to believe me when I tell them about it. That's why the book has like 750 citations, because I was like, I really did my homework here, and I promise you I'm not making this up. But I've taught this material now to quite a lot of people over quite a lot of time. I had hundreds of people be test readers of the book. Like, I've done my homework, and so I know for sure the parts where people just find it hard to believe. So for example, um, I do this exercise with founders all the time where I ask them to imagine who the most evil company in the world is.
Hmm.
And it's hilarious who people say. And if you tell me what age they are, I can tell you what they're going to say. Now I've really got it. I've really got it down. And it's interesting how it's changed. Like for younger people, companies that when I was growing up, we admired are now considered like not just bad, but the most evil company in the world. Like shocks me what people say. But anyway, but my father's a pulmonologist. I grew up as part of the anti-smoking crusades of the 80s and 90s. That was my childhood. So to me, always Philip Morris International will be like, you know,
Yes.
the number one worst. Because what could be worse than selling cigarettes to children? Like seriously, like it's just so evil. But whatever. Like I say in the book, and I acknowledge your values might be different than mine. And there's probably somebody listening to this who's like, well, my dad was a tobacco farmer, and I actually think like you're like legit, absolutely. Everyone gets to have their own values. So rather than pick my values, you pick your own values, and you imagine that person who you most would never want to work for, and never want your company or product in their hands. What if they offered you $1 more per share to buy your company than it's currently worth? Would you sell it? I've never met anyone who says yes to this question. Everyone's like either no, hell no, or something like truly unprintable, like, right?
But how often do you run right up against everything has a cost? Because that is, you put $1 a share, you now put a financial metric on it.
Right. Well, exactly. And even people who are quite greedy are still like, not for $1 per share. Like I've met people who are like, well, how much money are we talking? Like how many shares outstanding are there? Like people who want, I'm like, okay, but Siri, I want you to actually consider it. And I'll make the hypothetical as concrete as we need to make for the person to make a decision. I've never had anybody say yes. What's fascinating is I'm like, okay, great. Did you know that according to most governance experts, you yourself have a fiduciary duty to say yes?
Yeah.
And they're always like, no, that can't be right. You must have gotten it wrong. Surely that wouldn't be. And I'm like, well, and I joke in the book, I feel like Perry Mason, where I have to be like, is this your signature right here on this corporate charter that you yourself, like these are people often, sometimes they're future entrepreneurs or students, but quite often people who have a operating company with investors and employees, and they don't know what their own documents say. And they're like, I've had people look at it and they're like, well, it just says here, if you read a corporate charter, most people never have, but if you pull one up, it just says the Acme Corporation is hereby chartered to, quote, fill in the blanks. And today, almost every charter says to pursue any lawful act or purpose. And people say, that sounds pretty open-ended. What's wrong with that? And I'm like, oh, well, did you know that starting in 1986, plus or minus, the courts in not only the US, but around the world changed their mind and started to interpret that neutral charter as meaning that you are obligated to maximize shareholder returns. And this idea is called shareholder primacy. It is one of the most common and influential ideas in the world today. Most of us have been taught that it's like a natural law or an essential element of capitalism. But if you have a window, if you look out the window, I can see many trees out my window here that are older than this idea. Okay, this is not some bedrock principle of anything. This was a totally wacky idea that was in the 60s and 70s, people started to talk about adopting, and a set of judges and academics just decided that this is how it was going to be. And so now we live under this idea. And people sometimes are like, yeah, I hear you, but your $1 per share is a total exaggeration. Like, come on, man, that's not realistic. And so in the book, I tell the story of an actual company that was actually forcibly acquired by the actual Philip Morris. And you're right, $1 per share is an exaggeration. In real life, it was only 15 cents. And yet the board of directors said, we have no choice. It's our fiduciary duty to sell a healthcare company to Philip Morris. It was like one of the worst ideas you've ever heard. Anyway, I won't ruin the book. It's a tragic story. I shouldn't be making a joke out of it. But that's the world that we live in. We've inherited this messed up set of ideas and been told that it's the only way it can be. And part of what we have to do as builders is to say, wait a second, who decided this? And do I really agree with it? And if the answer is no, then we have to act accordingly.
And I think, we really do need to explore that question. But on the way to exploring that question, I think it is also a little bit important to understand, how did we get there? And one of the common refrains when we're talking about innovation is that, the forces that act against innovation are risk management and, unwillingness to face fear and bravery. And it strikes me that these false proxies, if you will, the idea that shareholder value is the appropriate proxy for the mission or the charter
Yeah.
of the company, in a way, is a safety net. It's a lie that we can tell ourselves that, makes our jobs as managers and executives easier, but actually just makes everything worse. It enshittifies the world. How, it can't just be a bunch of academics and judges decide some case law. What else is going on here that got us to where we are today?
Yeah, look, this is a topic for historians and sociologists and economists, people who are way above my pay grade. But having read a lot of their research, I think basically what has happened is, Schumpeter, the economist who was famous for creative destruction, Joseph
Mm-hmm.
Schumpeter, he actually wrote a passage that blew my mind where he basically predicted a lot of this. He was like, look, it's the very success of capitalism that makes it vulnerable to these things, because it was as everything becomes financialized. He didn't use this language, but if you translate his more archaic prose into how we would talk about it now, as financialization progresses, it hollows out the institutions that are necessary, like the civic society institutions that are necessary for capitalism to function, and it eventually will cause itself to collapse. And like what's so weird is he wrote that like in totally neutral language, like it's something everybody obviously knows. In the when he write in the 30s, I think. So like
Well,
it's
100
pretty.
years.
You read it now, you're like, how did he know that this was going to happen? Like, it's actually incredible. But I think that's really what we've been seeing is people like this is not really a business book. Like, don't tell anybody. But like it starts out as a business book, but it doesn't end there because this is a form of institutional decay that is afflicting every institution that governs our lives today. And it's an idea that's like infected so many leaders that has caused them to like narrow what they consider to be their job or their responsibility. And it's just as responsible for, like we've been selecting university presidents for their ability to raise money,
Yep.
and then we're like shocked that those people have no moral backbone. It's like, well, what did we select for? We're choosing, like, think about how many institutions, how many companies, how many political parties, how many like journalistic enterprises, just one thing after another, unions, you name it. Someone who's like coming of age as a worker today, entering the workforce for the first time, that's all they've known is institutional collapse one after the other. So if you look at the data, which shows that trust in
That's a
institutions is
dark
falling.
sentence.
What's that?
That's a dark sentence. Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
Yes, I mean, I feel like people complain about Gen Z all the time, but I'm like, well, they're the ones who should be complaining about us. What, like, because people like a common observation is like for people, the fact, like I have this data in the book. Look, there's just been a total collapse of trust in institutions, and when I tell young people about it, what they find surprising about it is how high it used to be. Because like when like in the dark ages of the 1970s, it wasn't uncommon for governments and healthcare, even big companies had approval ratings and trust ratings like sometimes in the high like 70s. Can you imagine, like people who are younger cannot imagine ever trusting any large institution under any circumstances, let alone trusting it with your life? Like that just seems crazy to them. Yet that's what we've seen. It's like a very, very marked collapse. And at the same time, so we have, and people, we feel paralyzed about it. People are like, well, I don't know what to do. We just don't have trust anymore. We've lost our ability to kind of do big things, and we don't really know what to do about it. Meanwhile, like so many of the safeguards that were designed to protect our capitalist system from overreach and self-destruction have been removed. And so just in our lifetimes, we've seen it over and over again where people basically take the foundations of our financial system. I always think of like we basically inherited this incredible house from our grandparents. And people have been like hacking at the foundations for firewood. And every time they take out a wall or rip up a bit of the floor and burn it, nothing bad happens. So like, oh, I guess it's fine. Oh, I guess it's fine. Well, eventually, if you do that, you're like a locust to your own house. Eventually, the thing collapses, and now we're starting to reap the rewards of that collapse. And again, this is a very, very wide spectrum problem that's afflicting nonprofits and NGOs and nation states and corporations. But I really think the essence of it is just this simple question of like how should organizations be governed? What are they for? What are they essentially? It's like a very philosophical question that we've lost the plot, lost our ability to answer. And so part of the solution is to recover this ancient wisdom. There's a lot of like old ideas that have to come back. And then, of course, we have to adapt that playbook and that infrastructure to our modern times, because obviously we're dealing with AI and computers and software and technology and bioscience, all kind of crazy stuff happening now. So to me, the challenge for our generation is to figure out, like, how do we put those pieces back together again to start to create a web of institutional trust, so that we'd be able to raise a generation who actually believed in this kind of social infrastructure. I call it the civic infrastructure in the book, that is all around them.
So as somebody with, young children, you are, this is music to my ears, because I do worry, as we all do, right, about the infrastructure that we're building. And I know that in the book, you have a number of, very prescriptive recommendations for everyone from organizational leaders to new hires. But I want to start with one of the things that I think people might find bewildering, right? You talk about the fact that somewhere along the line, fiduciary duty became sort of paramount for all of us as business managers. And you say something really interesting. You call shareholders tourists who should not have voting rights. And you have the analogy to tourists flying to France. And, if I fly to France, I can eat the food, I can drink the wine. I sure can't vote in the elections.
Yeah.
And obviously, that, I think a lot of people are going to hear that and be like, whoa.
Oh, yeah. It's very controversial. Now, to be clear, I'm talking about short-term investors, not long-term investors. So that's one important distinction. But still, even that, and again, just to give people the context, if people have not, I spent a lot of time in the financial system because I went up building this thing called the long-term stock exchange. And I feel like I got to see the heart of darkness up close. And most people, again, when I describe to people how it works, most people don't believe me. It doesn't seem possible. So I want you to imagine a political system. You described the first half of it. So imagine a political system where any tourist can vote. Okay, that's just how it is. You could just, if you want to change the laws of a country, you bring 1 million of your friends, you all fly over there on the same day on election day, and boom, now you're in charge. But it's actually worse than that. Imagine if I could also, in addition to doing that, I could borrow as much money as I want and buy up as many passports as I want. So I could just buy bulk passports, and if I show up with 1 million passports, I get 1 million votes.
Yep.
That would be ruled not just by who's the richest, because obviously the richest person in the world could buy the most passports, but it's actually ruled by whoever can borrow the most money. That is the political philosophy of our corporate governance system. The values of those who lend the money should win out.
Yeah.
Does that strike you as sane? Like, most normal people can't comprehend that you would ever, it seems totally bonkers to do that. Yet that's considered a best practice. That's considered the height of correct governance. So much so, and this is where I think it's really important to understand that these ideas go from like a descriptive phenomenon. Like, we describe the way shareholders relate to companies is like they have this power. There's even like the people talk about shareholder rights. They have a right to vote in the elections of the company. That's an idea. But then it passes from a data-driven idea into an ideology. So I'll give you one of my favorite examples. Costco. Talk a lot about Costco in the book. Costco's a great company. If you were lucky enough to invest $1 in the Costco IPO in 1985, whatever it was, you have 60 times more money than you would have had if you'd invested in the S&P 500 on that day. Okay, 60 times, not 60% more. It's been like one of the most successful stocks.
Wild outperformance over 30 to 40 years at this point. Yeah, 40 years. Wild outperformance over 40 years.
And I point out in the book that you could pick any time period you want. It's 20 years, 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, 1 year. Doesn't matter. Any period, Costco's outperformed the market. Okay, it's one of the best performing stocks ever. And Costco, if you study it, basically violates every best practice about how business is supposed to be run that we teach people the best practice. It's like drives me crazy having been teaching people business all these years. I'm like, I'm going to teach people ideas that are derived from these outlier companies like Costco or Toyota or Patagonia, you name it. And then I'm told later, like, oh, sorry, that's not good advice. You're violating the best practice. I'm like, well, how much better does it get than Toyota? How much better does it get than? It seems pretty good. Costco's at a $400 billion market cap. Seems good enough to me. How much more do you want? Anyway, so there was this episode. Since the time Costco went public, it has been under relentless and kind of periodic attacks from governance experts who think that the way that Costco is run is wrong. And I put some of these, my favorite quotes are in the book. There's these hilarious quotes. Like you have these Wall Street analysts that say things like, they say this with a straight face. This is considered actual analysis. Costco is taking money that rightfully belongs to shareholders and investing it in improving the customer experience. That's a criticism of Costco, right? They're doing something wrong by doing that. So like, yeah, it's completely nuts. Anyway, so one of the key ideas in modern governance theory is that if managers are insulated from short-term pressure from investors, that's called entrenchment. And entrenchment leads to poor performance because you don't have the discipline of the market to hold you accountable. Very logical sounding idea, but empirically turns out to be wrong. For example, since 2008, companies that have gotten bad governance scores have outperformed the companies that get good governance scores. Okay, just in terms of stock market performance, let alone their climate impacts and things like that. So anyway, Costco had this like a massive campaign against them, trying to destroy their governance and turn them into a conventional company on the theory that their management practices lead to entrenchment, which lead to poor performance. And I was like, you got to have severe mental, like what is going on in your brain that you would accuse Costco of all the things you accuse Costco of, poor performance? Like, isn't that wild? This was considered like a really reasonable position. There's like trillions of dollars of hedge funds and institutional investors follow these recommendations. And yet, you know, in the book, I give the example of Kroger. Kroger is a perfectly fine company. I have nothing against Kroger. They're a perfectly fine grocery store. But at the same time that Costco was resisting these attacks, Kroger gave in to them and adopted corporate best practices in like 2006, 2008. Now, who wants to guess which stock has dramatically outperformed the other since 2006, 2008? Yeah.
I want to guess.
Can you guess? I found an analyst who was writing an article about the 20-year performance of two companies, and they called Kroger like Costco in reverse. So here we have this case of like best practices versus worst practices. Which one is better for shareholders? I haven't said a word about mission, purpose, climate, like employees. Like there's all these other externalities, but I'm just talking about simply on the basis of investor performance, who's outperformed. Obviously, it's Costco. I wouldn't have given you the example. And so when I talk to founders now I'll take it back to your question about founders. We are awash. If you go to any board meeting at any size company, I'm talking about two guys in a garage, two girls in a garage, up to like multinationals. If you are big enough to have a board meeting, you will be big enough to have someone say the phrase best practice to you. And so I'm trying to train founders. When someone says best practice to you, I want you to translate it in your brain to Kroger practice. Okay, this is someone who thinks that you should be more like Kroger and less like Costco. If that's what you want, God bless you. But let's be honest about what we're talking about. If we're going to build these truly great companies, we have to learn from and adopt the actual best practices that actually drive the outperformance that we all crave.
And are these best practices, or are they simply like sort of reversion to the mean? Like, is some of this just an outlier issue?
I don't think so. That's a really good question. And of course, it's tricky when you do studies of outliers. Like I wouldn't write a book like this if all I was doing was looking at statistical inferences. Like I have actually built companies using these different practices. So I have a lot of actual real experience doing this that have given me a lot of confidence that this is right. But the problem with the outlier theories, there's too many of them. And it's very easy to prove it, which is really, this is the thing I find most fascinating, is that basically in every industry, there's like one of these outlier companies that we all know. We know that they do things differently, and we kind of don't remark on the fact. It's just like, oh, okay. So like everyone, I mean, any of you have a Vanguard, ETF or mutual fund in your portfolio? Like everyone knows Vanguard.
Yep.
Vanguard's one of these like really wacky companies with extremely unusual governance structure. They just celebrated their 50th anniversary, and I was talking to I think it was a general counsel, senior person at Vanguard, and he was telling me this crazy story. I didn't know the story. When John Bogle was starting Vanguard, he had to get his idea of how it should be done was that the investors, the customers of Vanguard should have the governance rights over the funds that they manage, so that fees would be maximally small, because the excess fees are returned back to the members. It's basically a cooperative financial cooperative. Yeah. It's an incredible model. That was such an unusual model. They had to get special permission from the SEC to form the company. And luckily, nobody thought it would work, so no one bothered to oppose them. This is 1975 when nobody cared.
Yep.
And I asked him, I was like, oh, that's so interesting. In the 50 years since, how many other people have applied for that same exemption from the SEC? No one. No one's even tried to copy Vanguard.
And how has Vanguard performed relative to them? I
Look
mean,
it up.
everybody knows.
They're
I mean,
doing pretty. They're doing pretty good. I don't have the stats in front of me, but they have an incredible amount of assets under management. And there's all these other companies. So like think about Patagonia and retail. We already talked about Costco. Tell a story of Novo Nordisk, or in the book, where you have these companies that have just achieved tremendous outlier performance. And yes, maybe you can, for any individual one of those companies, you could say, well, they got lucky. Okay, it was a great founder or whatever. But my claim is not, these companies are not special because of how much money they made, because of course there's plenty of companies that made a lot of money and then collapsed. What's really distinctive about them is longevity.
Yeah.
So most people, if you ask them what causes corruption, if they're not, some people will deny that there is any corruption, but people who, everyone who's tasted private equity in their favorite restaurant will not say that anymore. They'll be like, you say, what causes it? They will say either human greed. So it's just humans are greedy. And so what can you do? Of course, there's been greedy investors since time immemorial. There's nothing you can do about it. Or if they're a little bit more sophisticated, they'll say it's caused by scale. Fundamentally, as organizations grow, they lose that special spark of what they used to be. So they can't stay true to their mission because they're too big.
Yep.
And those are interesting theories, but both of them, this is what I find so fascinating. Both theories would say there really couldn't be exceptions, right? Because if I had to staff my organization with non-greedy people, where am I going to find them? And if scale causes the disease, then all large companies should succumb. And yet we have these exceptions, these companies that don't seem to feel the ill effects of scale and don't act in a greedy way, even though they're staffed with regular old people.
And have generational survival, right? We had a moment recently of sort of founder mode, right? The return of the leader, the entrepreneur. But I think you're making a point that, they have figured out how to systematize this beyond a single individual.
Yeah. I call it the architecture of institutional longevity. And it by definition cannot be accomplished via founder mode, because founders die. And I tell several stories in the book of founders and people who carve their values on the walls of the lobby of the building. Johnson Johnson, like very famously carved the Johnson Johnson credo as like an 8-foot limestone walls at headquarters. So like people have tried various things to like try to make this succession thing work, but it doesn't work unless the commitment to the ethos is woven into the DNA of the organization in a very particular way. That's, that I get into in the book. And we have lots and lots of examples of people failing to do it. So again, to go back to your question about outliers though, what's really incredible to me is that these quote unquote alternative structures are already running, like, depending on how you count, between 5 and 10% of world GDP. Okay, these are not small, like they're not small things.
Right.
So for example, one of my favorite studies by an academic named Steen Thompson looked at companies that are overseen by a nonprofit foundation. So it's called the industrial foundation. This is like Novo Nordisk.
I went down the rabbit hole, by the way, after you called this out, because I didn't believe it. But go ahead, because this was wild.
The data here is literally unbelievable. And yet we've all interacted. Anyone who's taken Ozempic has interacted with one of these structures. If you've ever eaten a Hershey candy bar or a Tony Chocolonely, this book is loaded with chocolate. People who like chocolate and confectionery are going to love this book, because there's tons of examples from I don't know why in chocolate. Maybe I was very hungry during the 2 years I was working on it. So anyways, you have these companies. IKEA, if you ever shopped at an IKEA, it has that structure. Patagonia has that structure. Hershey chocolate bar. Anyway, there's a lot of companies with this structure. It's not that uncommon.
And that structure is, to be very clear?
Oh, to be super clear, this is the specific structure of a nonprofit foundation overseeing or owning a for-profit subsidiary. So like take Carl Zeiss. If you have glasses, these are Zeiss lenses. Everyone has Zeiss lenses. A company was started in the 1850s. It's a very old company in Germany. They have a nonprofit foundation that owns a holding company. The holding company owns a series of for-profits. Some of those for-profits are public, some of them are private. And the for-profit ones can have outside investors. So it's like Novo Nordisk is traded on the New York Stock Exchange. It has millions of investors. That's like, one of the biggest companies in the world. So it's a structure that's been studied a lot. There's a lot of examples of it. So we have this like data set, companies with this structure. And one of the most striking findings of that data is that companies with that structure are 6 times more likely to live to age 50 than companies with a conventional structure. We're talking about 60% versus 10%. And remember, in order to study this, we have to study companies who were started like 50 years ago and more. It's getting much worse now. Like as this
Yeah.
study continues to be repeated, the divergence will grow because average corporate life cycles are collapsing as we teach people this very self-destructive business playbook.
Yeah. Okay. So Eric, you talk about how the corporate governance lessons, the best practices that we understand are actually wildly destructive in many ways and lead to corruption in these organizations, which makes total sense. But your book is incorruptible, which implies that there is a way to set things up to resist the corruption. And you have some really interesting concepts. We need to get to human flourishing in a bit, but let's just start at ground level. What makes an organization incorruptible in your mind?
Yeah, so I chose that word deliberately because I do believe it is possible to build organizations not that resist corruption or are less likely to be corrupted, but that are actually indivisibly, like qualitatively different in
A hell
kind.
of a claim. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a wild claim that is hard to believe, and it takes me 11 chapters to get there. So we're not gonna be able to summarize it. So it is quite out there, but I work it through in great detail. But what's important is that every step of the way, like this thing is built like a layer cake or a series of babushka dolls, like where like each component is connected to the one before. My promise to the reader at the beginning is that every practice is useful in itself and also part of this broader tapestry. So even people that don't want to or are not able to walk all the way to the end can still make their likelihood of falling to corruption dramatically less. And the book is structured in a very particular way where we start with the things that are most under leadership control, and then we move outwards. So I think of it like the innermost intention moving outwards to eventually encompass employees and investors and boards and all these other forces of society, eventually into political forces and things like that. And so the critical thing that I think a lot of founders miss is they're always looking for the one weird trick. Like, just tell me what I have to do. Is there a
Then
box I can check? Is there a template? It's a very common request I get. And so, yes, there are specific things you can do. You can become a public benefit corp. Like, this takes a 2-page filing. It takes 2 minutes. If you're a founder listening to me right now and you have a Delaware C corp and you have not made this 2-page filing, you're crazy. So tell your lawyer you want to do it. There's really easy things like that. We need to have a board mission pledge to make sure that directors of corporations use their discretion under what's called the business judgment rule to be supportive of mission. And then there's a bunch of operational things that are just management practices. You mentioned false proxies, like using the right measurement systems, using the right kind of metrics. A lot about culture in the book and how to develop high performance, strong culture companies. So each of those practices is like, think of it like a sheet of plate mail armor, where we're identifying a vector of corruption and finding a way to block it. And we can do that piecemeal, which is important because not all of us are the owner, operator, founder, and sole owner, sole proprietor of a for-profit corporation. Right? Some of us are just employees. Some of us are future founders. Some of us are future employees. Some of us are just consumers wanting to know who to buy from. And so I wrote the book in this way because I want everybody, not just founders, to be able to identify companies that are likely to become corrupt in the future, and avoid them. Like, because like people who go to work at a company that has this kind of collapse, like it's really bad for your career. And think about
yeah,
how many people have bought products from companies that fell to corruption. And like sometimes you just feel bad about yourself, like, oh man, like I can tell you how many people I see with, have to put like have to put a political bumper sticker basically on their Tesla to avoid saying that they endorse what the guy like it's actually become it was like a major source of identity crisis for people who didn't know
yeah,
what he was going to turn into. But we also have lots of examples of it becoming like a real health issue, because this is something that I think is very unappreciated. When you swallow a pill or you board a plane, you are literally putting your life in the hands of a whole web of institutions, most of whom you can't even name. And in the olden days, the bad old times, this was governed by a principle called caveat emptor, right? Let the buyer beware.
sure.
And in modern times, we have developed a whole series of systems that have shifted liability and responsibility from the buyer to the seller. called caveat venditor, that the vendor has to beware to make
Yeah.
sure what they're selling you is safe. And most of us have grown up. I mean, almost every person alive has grown up under this shield and doesn't even realize how amazing it is and how grateful we ought to be for it. Because as shareholder primacy has evolved, it has only one ineluctable, like inevitable conclusion that it must reach, logically speaking, which is if a company is considering the safety of its customers, it must only consider that factor insofar as that is beneficial to its shareholders. So one way to do that, of course, is to be extra safe, spend a lot of money on safety. But another way to do that is to spend that same money on lobbying to get the penalties for being unsafe changed
Yeah.
or hiding what you've done. And if you do the ROI calculation, in many situations, it is cheaper to cheat, lie, and steal than it is to do the right thing. And we have built an economic system that is encouraging people to do that. Again, everyone who hears this for the first time who's like a governance civilian is like, he's exaggerating. There's no way. But I
No.
can cite you chapter and verse on law review articles for the last 40 years that say this very, very directly. Like people, like if you talk to a governance person about that, they're like, yeah, obviously, of course. What do you? But most normal people are like, you're what? Like my life only has value insofar as it might lead to shareholder returns. Are you insane? What are you talking about?
Well,
That's where we are.
this is the fodder of all kinds of dystopian sci-fi and other
Oh
things.
my God, we're there. We're
We're
living it.
there.
This actually reminds me of one of my favorite sayings, or one of the best things that I've ever heard an essayist say. And that's that power doesn't corrupt, power reveals. And so, my question for you is, there an inherent sort of personality or set of values that find themselves in positions of power? And that's sort of what's making these wheels and these gears turn in the first place.
Yeah.
And kind of on the other side, how do you encourage founders who have a different value set to forge through that, break those gears, break the wheel, if you will, but still maintain the integrity of their value set without sacrificing jobs at their
Right.
company?
Right. This is hard stuff, and I really try hard in the book not to shy away from these moral dilemmas, and just to like really confront it head on. Because
Yeah,
again, outside of Silicon Valley, no, this is one of these things that nobody believes me, but it's really true. The vast majority of founders that I work with start out very idealistic,
Yeah.
including many of the ones whose names you know, and you're like, not that guy. But actually, I knew a lot of these people before they were rich and powerful, and like they're pretty idealistic. It's actually not as uncommon as you would think from what we see on TV today.
yeah,
And what happens is, I call it financial gravity in the book. Like it's a physical force that money, accumulations of power, money, status, it has a gravitational influence on the people around it. And one of the effects that it has is to transmit values unconsciously. So we reward this sociopathic behavior all up and down our economy today. And then
yeah,
we're shocked that we have sociopaths in positions of power. Duh. What would you expect? Right. So that's bad. But the worst and much more corrosive effect of that is when you get trapped in these hierarchies yourself, your own values start to change in ways that make you eventually unrecognizable even to yourself. And it's a very underappreciated aspect of the founder mental health crisis that we're seeing. Like if you wonder, like, why are all these rich, successful people having a mental breakdown in public on social media every day? My personal view is that they have become rich and powerful, and they have to be the hero of their own story, psychologically speaking. But they're not actually a hero. They're not going to be remembered as heroes. They've done really villainous stuff, and they can't they can't reconcile it because they were taught that if they followed this path, this good stuff would happen, and so it has to be somebody else's fault that they're getting all this criticism. And I think that's really sad. Like I honestly think, what is this all for? Like if even the people who are the quote unquote winners of this system are so manifestly miserable, what were the compromises for? And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that we've been telling ourselves is like, well, it's okay because the compromises are necessary. But the second you admit that they're choices and they're not necessary at all, and a big part of my goal in writing this book is to simply say, Now, I'm not trying to tell anybody what they ought to do. Okay. I'm not telling anyone what to do. Everyone do what you want. My goal is that if what you want to do is the right thing, I will arm you with all of the arguments and data you will need for the rest of your life to fend off the millions of people that will try to talk you out of it. Because people talk you out of it like you're a soft-hearted compromiser and you're not serious about business. But actually, the thing you are protecting is quantifiably like proven to be a source of competitive advantage. So you have to learn to say that out loud, and you have to learn to defend it. You have to learn to be like, no, sorry, I don't want to calculate the ROI of it. I'm not interested.
So what if it's like a situation where you've got the board's threatening to pull you, and you're no longer going to be the CEO, and you know that whoever replaces you, um, might end
Yep.
up,
Yeah, let's get into it.
betraying the mission.
No, that's it. That's it exactly. So first thing first, and I tell quite a few of these betrayal stories in the book. If you interview people who've been betrayed in that exact way and you ask them what went wrong, they almost always locate the problem in the wrong place. They don't learn from their experience. So here's, for example, I was talking to somebody who went through, I'm going to identify this person because they're awesome and I don't want them to feel bad. But they had built a company, made a lot of money for their investors, did a great job, and then like no matter how much money they made for their investors was never enough, and eventually they got deposed, kicked out of their own company, and the company's not as good as it was. Just like a very sad story actually. And they licked their wounds and they had to deal with it as a personal matter. Like that's a very hard trauma to live through. But they got back off the mat. I admire them tremendously for it. And they're building a new company. And I remember chatting with them and I was like, what lessons did you learn from this experience? And they were like very clear. Well, I trusted the wrong people. I put the wrong people on my board. I did blah, 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 blah. I was like, okay, but now that you're starting a new company, what governance changes are you considering for the new company compared to the old company? And he looked at me with completely blank and been like what? If you read any press story about this, I tell the story about John Mackey and Whole Foods in the book. You read the press coverage of the hedge fund activist that deposed him and got the company sold to Amazon. Every single story is written as this like clash of the titans personality conflict. Who will win, the greedy bastards or the conscious capitalism like hippie guy? And like we have a big fight, somebody wins, and whoever won is the more savvy person. So I guess in this case, the hedge fund is the winner. But like again, that locates the agency and the decisions in like the end of the process. Because the real question when you're asked about the board thing is what happened years before? Why did we set up such a flimsy structure in the first place that the board has this power? But anyway, but even when we screw it up, this is what I want to say. I've actually lived through that exact scenario you're describing. I'll tell you what it was like. I'll give it to you from the founder's perspective. I was preparing for a board meeting. I remember it clear as day, long time ago now. And I was very much sure I was going to be fired. Everyone was pissed off at me. The board was sick and tired of this, like, I was doing lean startup stuff before it was cool. And people were quite sick of it. And they're like, listen, you need to come to this board meeting and you need to tell them you're going to do things the conventional way. Okay. I was like, people were giving me advice, like, this is what you need to do. Because this is good. Otherwise, it's going to be your last board meeting. And so I remember sitting there. I was prepping for the meeting. I got a sleepless night. I woke up that morning. I remember I got a like gigantic, Starbucks full caffeine, full sugar. I got some like rocket fuel, and I'm like, I'm going to this meeting to like meet my doom. I was like, this will be the end. And I had this like moment of realization. I was like, wait a second. If I go in there and give them what they want, it's true that they might not fire me, but they're not going to be satisfied because the thing that they want me to do is not going to work. I know it's not going to work. So all I'm going to do is make myself complicit in something that I abhor. And then they're going to blame me for it anyway. And my integrity will be shattered. Conversely, if I go in there and tell them what I stand for and they fire me, from then on, everyone who knows will know that I'm the guy who stands for X. I was willing to be fired for X. And I was sitting there being, you know what? Someday, one of those people is going to be like, you know what we really need in this company? We find me someone who believes X, right? Like, because a lot of investors are not especially principled, like they're not like committed to some set of ideas. They just want to make money. Okay? They just want to make returns.
Yeah.
And so like if it's convenient to fire someone, like they'll fire someone and then invest in them, same person, like because the circumstances change, their views change. So I was like, I would rather be known as the person who had high integrity, who stands for X, than keep my job. And
Yeah.
I went into that meeting and I was like, with all respect, I was the youngest person in the room by far. You know, it was like, took a lot of chutzpah. I can't believe I did it when I look back at it now. It's like, with all respect, this is wrong and I'm not doing it. So you can get someone else to do it if you want, but I don't think it's going to work. Here's what I think is going to work instead. And I was shocked that they were like, okay. You know, they were like, okay, that's a good point. It's like, well argued, good point. And I was like, that was the end of it. I was stunned. I thought for sure I would be fired. So that's the other thing. The elements of the story I want people to take away is, first of all, you often convince yourself that you must do something or else, and there is no or else. Like, it's often a hallucination. And also, like, there are far worse things in this world than being fired for what you believe.
Well, and I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think there's a certain amount of, like, principle that's required in the world. But two, to me, that story that you just told is the story of somebody not letting themselves get drawn into the system that is destructive. And, that's actually quite important. And I want to now challenge you just a little bit
Please,
on,
please.
I want to connect some of these concepts in Incorruptible to the Lean Startup, and I want to actually explore a tension there that maybe doesn't exist. But let's just dive in. So it is really easy to, without thinking these days, think about speed and experimentation as the ultimate competitive advantage, and just let go of all steering and just kind of subsume yourself into some of these concepts taught in the Lean Startup.
Yeah, for sure.
And the interesting thing is, I feel like in Incorruptible, you're actually really telling people to slow down, be planful, and ensure that there are certain aspects of your organization that stay extraordinarily principled and structured so that they can be resilient to corruption. Square that circle for me. Those actually feel like two very different things. Respond to market with iteration versus.
No, I really like that question, because I screwed this up majorly when I first discovered Lean Startup. When I first discovered Lean Startup, I thought it meant that I had removed human judgment and principles from business altogether, and I had turned business into a crank that you turn. And I was like, this is the greatest news ever. And I feel really bad now, because I counseled a bunch of the earliest people who I ever gave it, who like asked me to give them startup advice. I gave them pretty bad advice. And I remember there's one company that, like, they basically wound up selling pornography, because they started out with something like that made sense, and this was the early days of Facebook platform, and it was just like, what do I have to do anything to make the Facebook algorithm make number go up?
Yeah.
And like, you
turns out
you're in some dark place. So actually, like, that was one less. I got that wrong. So first thing is, it took me a long time to understand that experimentation has to happen within a framework of principles. You have to decide what's negotiable and what's not. In particular, you can't experiment with the question of what kind of evidence you consider to be valid experimental evidence, right? Like, as soon as you say, I'm going to do Lean Startup, you've already made a non-scientific commitment.
Yes.
In the same way that if you decide you're going to do science, you have made an extra scientific commitment to the scientific method itself. You're making a philosophical commitment. I could never have used those words at that time, but I understand it now. The great Stanford engineering and management professor, Bob Sutton, taught it to me this way, because it was a big fad. Remember holacracy, which is going to have businesses with no hierarchy in them? He was like, it's wrong to say that a holacracy has no hierarchy. You misunderstand, because there's at least two levels. There's the guy who said we're going to be a holacracy, and everybody else.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, right. So first thing is, Lean Startup is already an extra evidentiary system that now, because it's a business idea, an institutional idea, we have scientific evidence that it works. So it's kind of confusing, but the evidence comes from outside the system, not from within. When you're within it as a company, you have to make the decision to adopt this management system. And you have to say that, like, I'm not interested in experimenting with whether to do it or not. I'm going to decide to do it. The second element, you're talking about slowing down and being principled. And this, I tried to be extremely clear in this book about this, because I struggle with this a lot. I tried in the book as much as possible not to use the word culture, and I tried not to use the word stakeholder. was actually very hard to write this book without
I've
these
got
two words.
I've got a whole presentation that's like 50% those two words, by the way. So I
Because they're very, very important, powerful words, but they have themselves become so co-opted by people who have like contradictory and vague meanings that for a lot of people, as soon as you start using those words, they're like, well, now I don't know what to do anymore, right? So I was like, no, I'm only going to write about things that are highly actionable that I know people can do. So I use the word ethos, not culture, to represent this kind of like character, this set of principled commitments that an organization has. And those are not subject to experimentation. So they can't be
Oh, okay.
my product spec can't be in the ethos, because of course that is, you're going to learn from the market about that. And what I would say now is that the commitment to lean startup is really two commitments. There is a question of like, what are we going to do? We're going to make like certain managerial commitments. We're going to use evidence, data, metrics. We're going to do hypothesis testing, right? But there's also a separate, much more deep commitment to the truth itself.
Yeah.
We're going to try to find out what the truth of our situation actually is. We're going to do that in a principled way. And when I proposed that originally, I couldn't have written the lean startup with this language in it, because I myself couldn't even see how radical that is. Because to me, that seems so obvious. Well, how else are you going to make decisions? What else could you be most committed to than the truth? I thought that was like sacred and obvious. And now, look around. I was quite naive about it. In fact, there's that very famous Reddit meme I'm sure you guys have seen. Anakin Skywalker and Padme are sitting in a field, and he says, I'm gonna change the world. And she says, for the better, right? And he just smiles, and
Yep.
she's like, for the better, right?
Right? Yeah. I know exactly the one.
You know that joke
Yep.
I'm talking about. I used to think that was such a funny joke, and I don't find it funny at all anymore. That's just a description of the world we live in. Like, it's so embarrassing. And since you have the book in front of you, I'll tell you, this is so embarrassing to me. Because I remember the first time I saw it, I'm like, I never made that mistake. I always specified for the better. But actually, if you go read the Lean Startup, then right there in the introduction, at the very end of the introduction, it says, we're going to do blah, 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 so that the next generation of entrepreneurs will have the tools they need to change the world.
Yeah.
Period.
Period.
It doesn't say, I just assumed, doesn't everybody want to make the world a better place? Well, turns out, actually, we probably should have specified a little more carefully.
And it is really interesting, because as an aside, I have a lot of conversations with entrepreneurs, founders, but also corporate innovators about the idea that, innovation implies adopted change, and adopted change is not necessarily for the better. And it is a really interesting system shock. But I want to get your comment on one aspect of this, because, there's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of case studies, there's a lot of citations in the book, but I'm kind of a simple person. And when I step back and, reflect on what I learned from the book in bullet point form, and I'm really curious to see if you're like, Ian, you're an idiot. But what I took away is basically that this concept of human flourishing, as in, what are you doing something good for people that they're going to want to work with you, is actually the only thing to be thinking about. And everything else is how you set up a structure to protect a focus on whatever bit of human flourishing your particular company does. I found that really interesting. And it forced me to ask, in my company, what is the human flourishing that we're driving? And we'll go down that rabbit hole another time. But do I have it right? Am I missing something?
Because that's actually, it's very interesting you say that, because the chapter on human flourishing used to be chapter 1. It used to be the first thing in the book.
And now it's like a third of the way in.
Yeah, now it doesn't come.
Sorry to interject, but for our listeners, can we maybe just expand on what human flourishing is for anyone who hasn't read the book?
Yeah, thank you. So to answer your question, yes, you got it right. And it's actually quite controversial, because my perspective is that what it means to make a profit, like literally what it means to be a for-profit company, is to maximize human flourishing, to leave all the people that an organization touches better off than if you had not existed. And some people hear that and they're just like, that is so radical. That's so out of the bounds of possibility. It's almost painful. But it's really just a restatement of what we were talking about a minute ago before about the moral logic of capitalism.
Mhm.
If that's what making a profit is, then the system works. And any other definition actually like causes this institutional collapse. So it's really a foundational choice. And what's interesting is I've talked to a lot of theory people about this, students, academics, whatever. People love to debate this kind of thing. But when I talk to builders, practitioners, they're always like, oh yeah, obviously. What did you think it was? But if you challenge them on this point, be like, okay, you say your thing is maximizing human flourishing, but is that actually the definition of profit you yourself have operationalized? I'll give you a funny story. There was one person I met with who hated ESG stuff, very anti-stakeholder, was like, I'm not woke, whatever. Is a very successful founder starting a
Yeah.
new company. And he was like, look, I'm just trying to make money for my investors, okay? Best way to do that is we're going to make a great product. In fact, like my ambition with this new company is to create a company that is like, for every engineer who comes to work here, this will be the greatest environment they've ever worked in for a product, for innovation, for engineering. And I was like, oh, interesting. So is it your experience in your life that this happens naturally? That's what organizations. He's like, no, of course not. The reason I have to create this new company is because my last two companies now suck, even though they were so great. Like, this is my principle. I'm going to stick to this. I'm going to do everything possible to do this. I would do anything for my employees. So he hates the word stakeholder, but he would literally die for his employees. I'm like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
There you go. I was like, okay, so hypothetically, you said before that you just want to make money for your investors. What if someone came to you with an idea? They say, listen, boss, I just realized we could save 3 cents a unit if we reduce the quality of it by making the engineering a little bit worse. No one would even notice. Yeah. Would you be okay? And he's like, I would never. And he was like screaming at me and so angry that this idea make him. I was like, but I thought you said you wanted to make money by any means necessary. He's like, well, not like that. Yeah. So it's like, listen, I know you're not woke. I know you don't like ESG, and I know you hate the word stakeholder, but you actually are revolutionary. You are proposing a very radical change to our economic system. He's like, what are you talking about? I'm just trying to make money. It's like, I know it sounds crazy, but the simple idea that you want to make money through product quality and you're not willing to make money other ways already puts you at odds with our whole modern sense of what business is all about. And so that's basically been my experience, that every person who's like sincerely committed to some principle, that they're starting a company not just to make money, but to accomplish any other purpose, is basically what they're saying is, I am slicing off some piece of human flourishing that's my piece to care about. So some people are, of course, focused on the environment. Some people are focused on efficiency. Some people are focused on beauty and art. There's like human flourishing is a vast tapestry that can support quite a lot of different missions and visions. But everyone's got to slice off some piece. And the counterintuitive finding in my research and in my experience is that if you do what you just described, you make that declaration consciously, and you take the steps to protect it, this crazy, almost unimaginable power is unleashed.
Yeah.
That I call it the power of magnetic attraction, that causes all kinds of impossible things to become possible. And I've witnessed it in my own companies, and I've seen it in other companies of people I really admire. And it's hard, and I've data coming out of every orifice to show that this is not just like an anecdote, but we see this, like in spades, that when people trust you, when they really believe that what you're doing is aligned with their deepest longing, like so many problems in business magically dissolve. So like people sometimes feel like human flourishing, it sounds kind of soft. It's like, so you serious about business? I'm like, no, this is as ruthless as it gets, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's a fundamental focus. And, not for nothing, I'm going to take that whole last sentence, starting with data out of every orifice, put it in Nano Banana and see what comes out. No, it's really
right.
true.
It serves me right. It's okay.
We have we just have a a little bit more time here. We've got a few more topics we want to touch on, because we could talk forever, but really what people need to do is go pick up the book. But I do want to ask. I want to ask about incumbents. I want to ask about the companies that have already fallen into the trap of corruption. And I want to ask, is there a path out? Is there a path out for the multinational, airline that has maybe lost the last vestiges of trust, or pick your industry.
Sure, sure.
Or is this actually just yet another reason that we all need to be paying attention to the next generation of companies?
Yeah. A key idea in the book is that it's always too early until it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
And the first implication of that is that most founders put these decisions off, but they get a lot harder later. So the earlier you can tackle this problem, the easier it will be to tackle. So I always encourage people, it's like that famous proverb about the best time to plant a tree. Of course, 40 years ago would be option number one, but option two is do it today. Don't put it off. That's really important. But a second implication of that idea that I think people often miss is that it's always better to start today than to wait. And that's true whether your company is 1 day old, a year old, 50 years old, public company, been public for 50 years, whatever, multinational, doesn't make any difference. You either are always making this problem better or you're making it worse. So in the book, I really try hard to give examples and try to encourage people who are maybe not the ultimate decision maker to nonetheless put these ideas into practice. And one way that I think is really powerful is by learning about governance. Most executives give themselves a chance to be part of the board level conversation. So it
Yep.
actually can be a career accelerator if you know what you're doing, to say, actually, I think there's something really powerful we need to do differently here. And what's interesting about it is it seems so difficult. Changing culture, changing, it seems so hard. And yet we do have these occasional turnaround stories where all of a sudden you'll have a company that used to be really exploitative be like, what would happen if we actually started treating people fairly? And
Yeah.
the magic it's a magic that starts immediately. The second you start doing it, it starts being real. So think about I don't know, I tell a story very, very briefly in the book about Blockbuster Video, which
Yeah.
we tell that story as like a disruption story, disrupted by Netflix. But that's really a surrogation, a false proxies story, because what happened is they became addicted to late fees. Even though customers
Yep.
hated late fees, it made them all this money. And they brought in a new CEO to eliminate late fees and try to do the turnaround. And their own investors basically fired him
They
because they're
rebel.
like, no,
Yeah.
we want the late fees back. So will it ultimately succeed? Not if you don't make governance reforms. But who decides the governance forms? At the end of the day, most of these decisions are made by a very small group of people. There's generally a relatively small board of directors who can just decide. And so you never know when the opportunity might present itself to sit down with the board and say, guys, I think we really need to make a change here. Let's do it. Again, will it work? Will it always be successful? I can't promise you anything. But by proving the elements of it step by step by step by step, you might be able to build up the credibility to find success. And I'll give you one other tip. People don't like this one, but it's the truth.
Oh.
Most people make too much money. Okay, not in the world at large. Obviously, we have a lot of people who are struggling to support themselves. Okay, but
Yep.
among the kind of people that we're talking about, who have the luxury to talk about management and innovation and governance and whatever, a lot of us make too much money. Now, I don't mean too much money in an absolute sense. I'm not against people being wealthy. It's fine. The question is the money you're making coming from human flourishing, or is it coming from extraction or exploitation, or do you not really know? Most people are in one of those three categories. If you're in category 2 or 3, if you know for sure that you work for a crappy company, or you're not sure, you have a problem. You have a moral problem that it's worth trying to fix. And I've worked with so many people who, over the years, who have come to me being like, I don't recognize myself anymore, or this company I thought it was going to be so great, now it's corrupt, or whatever. People have these crises of confidence sometimes, and we always start the same way, which is well, why don't you just start with the control you do have right now? Start standing up for what's right. Just do it today. Just try it out. What's the worst that can happen? They're like, well, I could be fired. Is that so bad?
Yeah.
I understand being fired is an unpleasant experience, but is it really so? It's much better than waking up one day and being like, what have I become? Or even now your kids won't talk to you because you're repellent to them. I know people who are unfathomably rich and they have this alienation in their lives. Is there any amount of money that's worth it? On the flip side, if you speak up, first of all, you might have impact. Your organization might change as in response to your speaking up. Most employees do not realize even close to how much power they have. Is one of the last and most important ideas in the book is although we talk about this phenomenon from the perspective of the organization itself, because I'm a company builder at heart, of course, that's my perspective. The stories and the powers all work both ways. We say that there's this magnetic attraction. Customers love your product because you're trustworthy. Well, that's caused by the customer's perception of things. So if you're a customer, you have this power, wield it. If you're an employer, a future employee, you can't imagine how much time your boss spends thinking about what they can get away with, right? Like what can I do and not do? What will my employees revolt about? Well, you have the choice to revolt. It's your choice. Just you could be a pain in the butt about the wrong thing, and you never know what might happen. So yes, you might have change, in which case you'll feel better about yourself, or you might get fired, or not even get fired, have it revealed to you that the organization you work for sucks. Sometimes you have
Can
that
I
moment of
inject?
clarity. Yeah, please.
Sorry, I don't mean to, but I want to inject just a little bit of pushback here because I
Yeah, please.
recently
No, let's
talked to
do it.
someone who was a founder of of a company, and it wasn't making as much money as they wanted to, simply to provide a very good living for the people that work for them, right? So you have
Yeah.
25 employees, and let's say each of them has a family of 2 or 3, right? So every job lost affects a ripple of people.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so inherently, let's say that, like, for the sake of this argument, that people are inherently good,
Mhm.
right? So on one hand, this person has the choice to put certain aspects of their software behind a paywall so that
Yeah.
they can give a better life to the people that work for them,
Mhm.
or they adhere to a set of principled values and they get fired, or the company just completely goes under because they
Yeah,
adhere
yeah,
to
yeah.
the
I'm
principles.
really
And
glad. Thank you for asking
s-
this question. It's very important, and it's really easy for what I'm saying to sound like kind of idealistic and unrealistic. So without the pushback, it's really important. So let's unpack that scenario, because that's a very real scenario, and I tell several stories of that type in the book. A very famous one is at Cloudflare. Company today is a hugely successful, IT security company worth like
okay,
$70 billion or something, a crazy success. And they had a moment where they had a product that actually they did the reverse of what you're describing. It was behind the paywall, and they decided to give it away for free. And I mean, I'll just tell you the story because I think it's important to understand the difference between having an ethos and feeling committed to make money by whatever means possible. Like it's very, very important to see this distinction. So here's what happened. Founders of Cloudflare, Matthew and Michelle, they were not into vision, mission stuff. Okay, like we would ask them in the early days, like, do you have a mission or a vision? They'd be like, blah blah. That's just marketing speak. We don't care about that. So they were like very practical. They would think it was a firewall in the cloud, and that's what it did. It was this like technical product, the engineering driven culture. And if you asked if they had a vision, a mission, they would have said no. And then they were having dinner, one day, just hanging out with their with their company was so relatively small. And one of the engineers is like, what I really like about this company is I feel like every day I'm working to make a better internet. And everyone's like, yeah, this is the first job I've ever had where I feel like I'm making the internet better every day. They're like, everyone's like, yeah, make it better. Anyway, so people kept saying that phrase over and over again. And one day they sat there and someone was like, is that our mission? To make a better internet? At first, they were like, no, that's just marketing speak. But after a while, they were like, oh no, maybe it is. So first thing to understand is that vision, mission, these things are discovered, not chosen. Okay, you don't just decide. It's something that emerges. It's an emergent property of the collective intelligence of the community. So anyway, one day, now fast forward a few years later, this is the early days of encryption on the internet. And Cloudflare had a premium product. So it was free. You get the firewall for free, but if you wanted encryption, you paid. It was like the number one reason people converted from free to paid in their freemium business model. That made a lot of sense to everybody because, first of all, encryption costs money to implement. You have to buy a certificate from a certification authority, and it was like technically difficult to part of like server bandwidth and space processing power for the mathematics
yeah,
of the encryption. This is all a little bit dated now. These things, we don't have these issues quite the same as we do back then. So
New
anyway, that's why it
forms.
was a premium feature. So one day, a French engineer was talking to Matthew, and he said, I thought our mission was to make a better internet. He said, yeah. And you said that like I look at our corporate values. Corporate value number one is to be principled. Uh-huh. So isn't an encrypted internet a better internet? So how come we charge people money for it? Now, almost any CEO in any company in the world, when confronted with a statement like this from a junior person would basically give them the rhetorical equivalent of a smack on the face or a pat on the head and be like, well, that's nice. But anyway, that's where we make
Yeah.
our money. So go back to the
Thanks
salt
for
mines,
playing.
but yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for your input. I really value your perspective. Anyway, but Matthew Prince, he told me the story. It blew my mind. He was like, he said, he was like, oh no, I guess you're right. And they had like a code red. They were like, we need to give this away. Now, the key to the story is they weren't just like, okay, we're going to start losing money. He talks about how it's not mission or business model. It's got to be mission and business model integrated. So they actually worked incredibly hard for weeks, or I think it was even months of like relentless engineering effort to try to figure out how they could give this thing away for free and still survive. So they did this principle in the book I call harder is easier. You do the harder work to make your life easier down the road. And they had like a technical breakthrough that allowed them to solve the technical issue of being able to scale up the number of certificates that they host. And they had a much more difficult biz dev challenge. They had to convince these certification authorities to give them the certificates for free. And they did this very complicated, very clever thing called a contra deal where they took on the bandwidth costs of the provider. Anyway, it was a very, very, very clever bit of business and technical engineering to accomplish this goal. And they gave the thing away for free. And it's like a seminal moment in the history of the internet because like today, almost all websites are SSL encrypted. We take that for granted, but big part of the reason why is because Cloudflare made this choice. Now, here's what's really interesting about it. Matthew described to me the board meeting. He's like, hi, everybody. Our top premium feature that is the reason people convert to paying, we're going to give it away for free. And the board was like, what? Like, excuse me, what? Like, why are you doing that? He's like, because it's the right thing to do. And they were like, well, do you know that this is going to work out? And he's like, nope, we don't, but it's the right thing to do. And let me show you the spreadsheet. We've worked it out. We figured out how to drive the cost down. So it's not going to bankrupt us, but we don't know that will necessarily make us more money. Now, in retrospect, it did make them a lot more money. Spoiler alert, they made way, way more money because although their conversion rates went down a lot, the top of the funnel grew exponentially. And so that more than offset them for their cost. Now, we don't know, they didn't know, but the key is they didn't know at that time that it would turn out that way. So I think that is really what I'm talking about. It's not just like you give the paywall example. I wouldn't say it's automatically obvious from the outside that it's better or worse to have a paywall. Right? Like, well, you got to tell me what's your mission. Is your mission to make a better internet? Is the paywall making the internet better or worse? Right? Like you have to actually be clear about what is it, what are we doing? And that's actually why I try to avoid the word stakeholder. So much stakeholder discourse is about compromise. Right? It's like, well, who are my stakeholders? A lot of companies are like, my stakeholders are employees and customers. It's like, okay, what happens if what customers want and what employees want are at odds? And it's like, I don't know. Right? Like, well, you don't know. If you don't know, then you haven't made any kind of commitment. This is actually, we call them stakeholders. That's not real. You got to tell me who's more important and under what, who gets compromised for what. And unfortunately, we live in a world today where basically no matter what anybody says, they actually wind up sacrificing everybody for shareholders. Shareholders are the only fiduciary commitment. But if you want to have a different commitment, you can make it. It requires you to do this hard work to figure out, okay, like what actually is maximizing human flourishing? Is it better to have the paywall or not have the paywall? Like if we get money from people, what do we spend the money on? Like how it forces a whole different kind of conversation about business. But in my experience, those constraints are what create breakthroughs. And so the leaders I admire the most, the really high integrity leaders that I have come to really like learn from, they love that their ethos causes this problem all the time. Like the difficulty of it is a feature, not a bug. Because the more you encounter these constraints, the more opportunities you have to find the nonlinear breakthrough that everyone else overlooks. And you see that in all the really great companies, the Costcos and the Patagonias and the Cloudflares, and so many more that are in the book. There'll be these like relentless difficulties that lead to breakthroughs that you can't get any other way. And that's ultimately why this way of working is more profitable.
Well, I mean, this is a lot to think about. And Eric, I'm not going to lie, I've been on an emotional journey for the last little while as we've been doing this, because we started, basically being slow boiled into a dystopian sci-fi world of enshittification. But my takeaway from Incorruptible is that there are some principles and a bit of a blueprint that founders, leaders, and everyone the most, junior staff getting hired into an organization can follow. And it's something that I think we're all going to internalize. And I do, having sat with some of these concepts for a little while and having had this conversation, I can't say I have confidence, 100% that this is going to take the business world by storm in the way Lean Startup did, but I hope it does. I genuinely hope it does.
Thank you for saying that.
And so, I want to say thank you for sharing your ideas, and thank you for coming on Innovators Inside. It's been an absolute pleasure. And for all of our listeners that want to learn more and want to follow your work, I assume go pick up the book. But, where else should they find you?
Yes, as they say, wherever books are sold, you can find Incorruptible in hardcover, in audiobook, and of course in ebook. If you want to follow me, the best way is to subscribe to my newsletter, which you can access on incorruptible.co. We also have tons of other resources there, reader's guides, implementation guides, all kinds of stuff. So really trying hard to make this as practical as we can. And I guess, if you want to follow me on social media, although mainly I would recommend you get off social media, I am on Blue Sky at Eric Ries.
Incredible. Well, Eric Ries, author of Incorruptible, thank you for joining us on Innovators Inside, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.